The heavy scent of roasted lamb filled the dining room, but it felt suffocating rather than inviting. I sat stiffly in my chair, watching the candlelight flicker against my parents' expensive silverware. My 9-year-old son Leo sat next to me, his small shoulders hunched toward his plate. He hadn't touched his food. My mother, Evelyn, sat at the head of the table, her eyes sharp and cold as she watched him struggle with his fork. The silence was thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the clinking of crystal. Suddenly, my mother leaned forward with a sharp smirk on her face. She didn't look at me, she looked directly at Leo. "Some people should really remember their place before they sit at a table like this," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I felt a chill run down my spine. I looked at my father, expecting him to say something, but he just stared at his wine glass. Leo's hand began to shake, and he accidentally dropped his fork onto the porcelain plate with a loud clang. The sound seemed to echo forever in the quiet room. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized this dinner was never meant to be a celebration of family. It was a trap. The sound of the fork hitting the plate seemed to trigger something in my father. Instead of offering a kind word, he let out a loud, booming laugh that felt like a slap in the face. He leaned back in his leather chair, pointing a finger at my trembling son. "Look at that," he hooted. "The boy can't even hold a piece of silver without falling apart." Leo's eyes filled with tears, and he gripped my sleeve, whispering quietly that Grandma was staring at him again with those mean eyes. I felt a surge of protective rage, and I started to push my chair back to stand up. I wasn't going to let them do this to him. But before I could move, my husband, Mark, reached out and squeezed my wrist tightly under the table. His grip was firm, almost painful. He leaned in close to my ear and hissed a warning that turned my blood to ice. "Don't you dare embarrass us," he whispered, his voice low and threatening. He wasn't looking at Leo's tears. He was looking at my parents, seeking their approval. My son began to sob quietly, the tears finally spilling over his cheeks. My parents didn't stop laughing. They just exchanged a look of pure triumph. The laughter eventually died down, but the cruelty was just getting started. My mother stood up, smoothing her silk dress, and raised her wine glass for a toast. The room went quiet again, but it was a jagged, ugly silence. "I want to thank everyone for being here," she began, her eyes scanning the room. "It is so important to be surrounded by real family, people who actually contribute to our legacy." She paused, her gaze landing heavily on me and Leo. "It's a shame that some guests are only here because of mistakes we made in the past," she added pointedly. I felt the air leave my lungs. She was calling my son a mistake to his face. She looked straight at Leo, who was trying to wipe his eyes with his napkin. "Children should learn early on when they are not wanted in certain circles," she said with a cold, final tone. I expected Mark to jump up in our defense, to demand an apology for such a vile statement. Instead, he simply picked up his glass and clinked it against the side of hers. He smiled at her as if she had said something wonderful. I sat there, frozen, saying absolutely nothing as the betrayal settled into my bones. I couldn't handle the sight of them any longer. I stood up, took Leo's hand, and walked toward the hallway. "We need a minute," I managed to choke out. I led Leo into the guest bathroom and locked the door behind us. He immediately collapsed against me, his small frame shaking with heavy sobs. "Why does Grandma hate me, Mom?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Did I do something wrong?" I pulled him into a hug, feeling my own tears start to sting. How do you explain to a child that his own grandparents view him as an eyesore? I couldn't find the words to answer him, so I just held him until his breathing slowed down. When we finally stepped back out into the hallway, I heard my father's voice booming from the dining room. "If she had raised him with any backbone, he wouldn't be so sensitive," he said loudly, clearly wanting me to hear. Mark was sitting right there, nodding along. He didn't defend us or tell them they had gone too far. He just looked up at me with an annoyed expression. "Can we just finish dinner like adults now?" he asked, as if Leo's heartbreak was just a minor inconvenience to his evening. The ride home was the loneliest journey of my life. Leo sat in the back seat, staring out the window into the darkness, completely silent. He looked hollow, like the light had been dimmed inside him. Mark drove with both hands on the wheel, humming a tune as if we had just come from a lovely party. I waited until we were halfway home before I finally found my voice. "Why didn't you stand up for us, Mark?" I asked, my voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "They were mocking your son. They called us mistakes." Mark didn't even turn his head to look at me. He just sighed a long, frustrated sound. "You knew what they were like before we went," he said coldly. "Why did you even bring him if you were going to get all dramatic about it?" That was the moment the scale finally fell from my eyes. He wasn't just staying quiet to keep the peace. He blamed me for the conflict. He saw Leo's pain as my fault for bringing him to a place where he wasn't wanted. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with cruel parents. I was living with a man who had chosen their side over his own family's safety. Sleep felt impossible that night. I lay in bed, listening to Mark's steady rhythmic breathing, feeling like a stranger in my own home. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's smirk and heard my father's booming laugh. Around 2 a.m. my phone vibrated on the nightstand. It was a text message from my sister-in-law, Elena. She had been at the dinner but had stayed quiet, her face pale the entire time. "I'm so sorry," the message read. "I should have said something. They actually planned that entire dinner, Chloe. Your mom told us weeks ago she wanted to put you in your place and show you that you don't belong in the inner circle." I sat up in the dark, reading the word planned over and over again. It wasn't a spontaneous outburst of cruelty. It was a coordinated, intentional strike meant to break my spirit and humiliate my son. They had invited us there specifically to hurt us. As I looked at Mark sleeping peacefully beside me, I wondered how much he had known about this plan. The betrayal felt like a physical weight on my chest, making it hard to breathe in the quiet room. A dark suspicion began to take root in my mind. If my parents had planned this, and Mark was so adamant about me staying quiet, what else was happening behind my back? I waited until I was sure Mark was in a deep sleep. Then I crept out of bed and went to his home office. His laptop was sitting on the desk. I knew his password. He had never thought I had a reason to check his things. I opened his email account and typed my name into the search bar. My heart nearly stopped at the results. There were hundreds of emails between him and my parents, spanning back several years. They weren't just business updates. They were filled with nasty comments about me. They mocked my career choices and called me temporary. My father had even made a joke in one email that Leo wasn't really family, because he didn't have the family's ambition. One message from my mother stood out, dated just a month ago. "She's lucky we even let her sit at our table. Make sure she understands her position." Mark replied to it with a laughing emoji. He had been laughing at me with them for years. As I scrolled deeper into the email threads, the true motivation for Mark's betrayal came into focus. It wasn't just about belonging. It was about money. I found a thread titled Estate Planning that involved my father, my mother, and Mark. Buried in the legal jargon of those emails was something far worse than just insults. My parents had drafted a formal agreement. They had promised Mark a massive inheritance, including a significant portion of the family trust and several properties, but it came with a very specific clause. He would only receive the money if he kept me under control, and ensured I never caused any friction or defended myself against my parents' authority. They were literally paying my husband for my silence. He was being rewarded for allowing them to abuse me and our son. He had put a price tag on our dignity and our happiness. Every time he told me not to embarrass them, he was protecting his future paycheck. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I wasn't his wife. I was a box he had to check to get his hands on my parents' fortune. The next morning I moved like a ghost. I didn't scream or cry. I made breakfast for Leo, who was still quiet and withdrawn. I waited until Mark left for work. Then I took his laptop and made copies of every single email and document I had found. I also downloaded several voice memos Mark had saved of him talking to my father. I haven't confronted them yet. I knew that if I acted out of emotion, they would use their power and money to crush me. I needed professional help. I called an old friend who was a high-profile family attorney and managed to get an emergency appointment. I walked into her office and laid out the printed emails and the recordings. She spent an hour going through them, her face becoming more serious with every page. Finally, she looked up at me. "Chloe, this is more than just a bad marriage," she said. "You've been financially and emotionally manipulated for years as part of a structured agreement. This is evidence of a conspiracy to commit emotional abuse for financial gain." She told me I had enough to end everything, but I told her I didn't just want to end it. I wanted them to feel the consequences. While I was planning my next move, the phone rang. It was Leo's school. His teacher, Mrs. Gable, sounded deeply concerned. "Chloe, Leo has been crying in the back of the classroom today," she told me. "He didn't want to play during recess. When I asked him what was wrong, he told another child, 'My family says I don't belong at the table.' That sentence destroyed me. Hearing his pain mirrored back through his teacher's voice was the final straw. My son was internalizing their cruelty, believing that his value was tied to their approval. I thanked Mrs. Gable and hung up, my hands shaking with a new kind of resolve. I had been playing the role of the quiet, dutiful daughter for too long. I had allowed these monsters to live in my head and my home. I looked at the folder of evidence on my kitchen counter and felt a cold, hard sense of calm settle over me. The time for being sensitive was over. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. A perfect family image, right until the moment I shattered it into 1,000 pieces for the whole world to see. For the next 2 weeks, I became a master actress. I acted completely normal at home. I cooked Mark's favorite meals, I smiled when he talked about his day, and I never brought up the dinner again. Mark actually seemed relieved. He even had the nerve to pat my hand one evening and say, "See? I told you that you always get emotional for nothing. Everything is fine now." I just nodded and forced a smile, while inside I was counting down the days. The opportunity one was waiting for arrived in the form of a gold-embossed invitation. My mother was hosting her annual public charity gala. It was the biggest event of the year for the local elite, a night where she could play the role of the generous philanthropist. She wanted the perfect family on stage with her to show off her success. She insisted that Leo and I attend and stand right beside her during her keynote speech. She thought she had me back under her thumb. I accepted the invitation with a gracious note, knowing this would be the stage for their ultimate downfall. A week before the gala, my mother insisted I come over for a final dress fitting. She had already bought a dress for me without asking for my input. When I arrived, she forced me into a designer gown that was clearly 2 sizes too small. It was tight, restrictive, and incredibly uncomfortable. As she zipped it up, she pinched my skin on purpose. "You should be grateful I'm even letting you represent our family after that little scene you made at dinner," she sneered. I stood still, looking at myself in the mirror, feeling like a doll she was trying to break. She leaned in close to my ear, her breath smelling of expensive peppermint. "When we are on that stage, you will smile," she whispered. "If you don't, I will make sure everyone in this town knows exactly where you came from and how little you're actually worth." I looked at her reflection, met her eyes, and gave her the biggest, most convincing smile of my life. "Don't worry, Mother," I said softly. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who we are." The night of the gala arrived. The ballroom was filled with hundreds of wealthy donors, politicians, and reporters. Huge cameras were set up to live stream the event to the charity's thousands of followers online. My parents were in their element, floating through the crowd and accepting compliments. Mark looked smug in his tuxedo, already acting like he owned the room. I kept Leo close to me, whispering to him that he was brave and that everything was going to change tonight. As I scanned the room, I spotted Elena, my sister-in-law, standing near the technical booth. We made eye contact, and she gave me a very subtle, firm nod. She had been the one to help me get the files into the right hands. She was tired of the cruelty too, and she was ready to see the truth come out. My heart was pounding so hard I thought people could see it through my dress, but I kept my face calm. The announcer called for everyone to take their seats, and my mother began walking toward the stage with a triumphant look on her face. My mother took the stage to a standing ovation. She looked the part of a saint, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlight. She began her speech, talking passionately about kindness, the importance of generosity, and the sacred bond of family values. The audience was captivated, many of them nodding along and applauding her words. I stood in the wings with Mark and Leo, waiting for our cue to join her. My hands were shaking violently, so I tucked them into the folds of my dress. "And now," my mother said, her voice booming through the speakers, "I want to invite my wonderful family to join me. My daughter, Chloe, and my grandson, Leo." This was the moment. As we walked out onto the stage, the giant screen behind her flickered. It was supposed to show a slideshow of her charity work over the last year. Instead, my name appeared in giant bold letters across the screen. My mother didn't see it yet. She was too busy smiling at the cameras. But the room suddenly went very, very quiet. The projector didn't show photos of orphanages or food drives. Instead, a video began to play with high-quality audio that filled every corner of the ballroom. It was a recording from dinner. The entire room heard my mother's voice sneering. "Some people should remember their place." Then came the sound of my father's booming laugh as Leo's fork hit the plate. The giant screen showed the emails I had found, zoomed in so everyone could read the words temporary and mistake. The audio of my father laughing while my son cried was played on a loop, clear and haunting. My mother turned around, her face twisting in horror as she saw her own cruelty being broadcast to her donors. The silence in the room was deafening. It was a heavy, judgmental silence that broke the image she had spent decades building. I looked out at the audience and saw people covering their mouths in shock. The saint of the city had just been unmasked as a monster who mocked her own grandson for sport. The screen shifted again, and this time it displayed the estate planning emails. The specific clause about paying Mark for my silence was highlighted in bright red. The audience gasped as they realized my husband had been bought and paid for by my parents. Mark, who had been standing proudly just a moment ago, looked like he wanted to vanish. His face went completely white as he realized his financial future was disappearing in real time. He started shouting at the technical crew, waving his arms and demanding they turn the projector off. But Elena and the team I had hired had locked the system. He looked at me, his eyes full of rage and panic, but I just stood there, holding Leo's hand. I wasn't this sensitive girl anymore. I was the person who had just pulled the plug on his entire life. The inheritance he had betrayed us for was now the evidence that would make him a social pariah. He tried to move toward the screen, but he tripped over a wire, falling clumsily in front of everyone. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous. The whispering started at the front and moved like a wave to the back of the room. People who had just been applauding my mother were now looking at her with pure disgust. Several major donors stood up and began walking toward the exits without a word. One woman, a longtime family friend, stood up and yelled, "You used this charity to hide your own abuse." The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of the chaos for the live stream. Security guards, confused by the situation, began to approach the stage. My parents were trapped in the spotlight, unable to run and unable to explain away the words they had typed and spoken. My father tried to bluster to claim it was all a fake, but the audio was too clear, and the email headers were undeniable. Their reputation, the only thing they truly loved, was being shredded in front of the very people they cared about impressing. They had wanted us on display, and now they were the ones being scrutinized. The screen went black for a second, and then the final recording played. It was a voice memo from my mother's phone that Elena had found. "She'll never leave," my mother's voice echoed through the speakers, sounding bored and arrogant. "She has nowhere to go and no one to help her. She'll sit at that table and take whatever we give her because she's weak." That was the moment I stepped forward to the microphone. The room went even quieter if that was possible. I looked directly into the main camera, knowing my words were going out to the entire city. "You were right about one thing, Mother," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I did have nowhere to go, until I realized that nowhere was better than being anywhere near you." I looked at the crowd and told them everything. I told them about Leo crying at school, about the planned dinner, and about the years of silence I had endured. "You laughed while my child cried," I said, looking at my parents. "Tonight, the world gets to hear it too." The fallout was more explosive than I could have imagined. Within minutes of me stepping off the stage, the charity's board members began sending out mass resignations via their phones. They didn't want their names anywhere near a family that viewed children as mistakes. Sponsors began calling the event organizers to pull their funding immediately. The gala, which was supposed to go on for another 3 hours, was effectively shut down. People were literally running for their cars to avoid being seen in the background of the news reports. My parents were left standing on an empty stage, the lights still glaring down on them, looking small and old. I didn't wait for them to speak. I walked out of the ballroom with Leo, my head held high. For the first time in my life, I didn't care what they thought or what they would do next. I had taken away the only power they had. Their secrets. As we reached the exit, I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. We were finally free. We didn't get very far before Mark caught up to us in the parking lot. He was sweating, his tuxedo disheveled, and he was screaming my name. He grabbed my arm, begging me to talk to him. "What did you do?" he hissed, his voice cracking. "You ruined everything. The inheritance, the business connections, our entire future. It's all gone." I pulled my arm away from him with a look of pure coldness. I didn't see the man I had married. I saw a stranger who had sold his soul for a paycheck. "No, Mark," I said, my voice like ice. "I didn't ruin us. You helped them ruin us the moment you stayed silent for a bribe." He looked at Leo, trying to play the dad card, but Leo just hid behind me. My son knew exactly who had stood up for him and who hadn't. Mark tried to apologize, to say he was doing it for our future, but I just turned my back on him. I had already made arrangements. I wasn't going back to that house, and I was never going back to him. I drove straight to a small apartment I had rented in secret 3 days prior. When we walked inside, Mark's bags were already there. I had sent them ahead with a moving company while he was at work. Actually, they weren't Mark's bags. They were mine and Leo's. I had left his things in our old house, along with a thick envelope on the kitchen table. Inside that envelope were the divorce papers. He called me dozens of times that night, his messages shifting from begging to threats. "You'll regret this, Chloe," he screamed in one voicemail. "You have nothing without my family's backing." I listened to it once and then deleted it. I didn't feel regret. I didn't feel fear. I picked up my phone and sent one last text to him. "I already regret staying as long as I did. Don't call again." I blocked his number and sat on the floor of our new, empty living room with Leo. It was quiet, peaceful, and for the first time in years it felt like home. The next morning the story was everywhere. The video from the gala had gone viral, racking up millions of views in just a few hours. The Family Values charity was being investigated for financial irregularities, and my parents' business was losing clients by the minute. My mother, desperate to save what was left of her reputation, released a long, fake apology online. She claimed the recordings were taken out of context and that she loved her grandson dearly. But the internet wasn't buying it. The comment section was a war zone, with thousands of people tearing her apart for her cruelty. People shared their own stories of family abuse, using my video as a rallying cry. My parents were no longer the elite of the city. They were a cautionary tale. They tried to send their lawyers after me, but my attorney reminded them that if they sued, even more evidence would come out in discovery. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, and the doors were locked from the outside. 2 weeks later, the dust began to settle. Leo was back in school, and for the first time, his teacher said he was participating in class and smiling again. We had dinner that night with Elena and a few close friends who had supported me through the transition. The table was small, the food was just pizza, and the plates were mismatched. But the atmosphere was filled with genuine laughter and warmth. Leo was telling a story about a drawing he made, and everyone was listening, actually listening. He stopped mid-sentence, looked around the table, and a huge grin spread across his face. "This feels like a real family, Mom," he whispered. My heart swelled with a mixture of pain and joy. It shouldn't have been this hard to get to this point, but we were here. We were sitting at a table where we belonged, and no one was mocking us or waiting for us to fail. We had lost a fortune, but we had gained our lives back. One final message came through on a burner phone I hadn't blocked yet. It was from my mother. No apology this time, just pure, unfiltered venom. "You destroyed us," it read. "You destroyed your father's legacy and everything we worked for. I hope you're happy living in your little nothing life." I looked at the message, and then I looked at Leo, who was currently laughing at a joke Elena had told. He looked healthy. He looked safe. I typed out one last reply. "No, Mother. I didn't destroy you. You just finally met the consequences of your own actions." I hit send and then walked over to the trash can and dropped the phone inside. I didn't need to hear from them ever again. Their legacy was a lie, and their something was built on making others feel like nothing. I chose the nothing life every single time if it meant my son could breathe. The final divorce hearing was quick. Mark didn't even show up. He had moved to another state to try and escape the scandal. I got sole custody of Leo and a fair settlement from our joint assets. I didn't take a dime of my parents' money, and I didn't want it. I took a job at a local non-profit, helping families who were dealing with domestic and emotional trauma. It didn't pay as much as Mark's old salary, but I slept soundly every night. One evening I walked into the kitchen to find Leo sitting at the table, doing his homework. He looked up at me and smiled, a real bright smile that reached his eyes. "Hey Mom," he said, "can we have tacos tonight?" I laughed and started pulling the ingredients out of the fridge. As we sat down to eat, I realized that the place my mother wanted me to remember was exactly where I was. At a table filled with love, truth, and a son who finally ate without a single ounce of fear. We belonged here.